Hello and welcome to this free video workshop for Miranda's Magic Fairy Coat. It is knitted on a machine with 46 or 48 needles. And when you don't have a machine with 46 or 48 needles, you can also knit it on a 22 needle circular knitting machine. But for that you have to find the link in the description of this video. For this magic coat, we are going to use the circular knitting machine to the max. We are going to use it for knitting tubes and we are going to use it for knitting panels that are shaped. Don't go away yet because I'm going to explain everything in this video. When you never have knitted with a machine, you're able to make this fairy coat, really. In the video are timestamps. You can skip chapters by using the timestamps. When there is a chapter, you already know how to do it. I'm going to explain how you can adjust the size of your cardigan in width and in length. It's very simple, not complicated. I did the math already for you and I made it very easy for you when you want to increase or decrease the size. But basically the coat is kind of one size fits all. And on the go while making, you're fitting it and you can adjust it when you're making it. So that's very easy. You're allowed to smuggle. You can put a corset lacing on the back. You can do that yourself by knitting I-cords and pull them through or something. I don't use it because I don't like the hump in my back then. There is no closure on the front, but you can use a thing like this, a buckle like this. Yes, I was looking, I'm Dutch. A buckle like this. You can put it in your hair, but you can also use it to close your cardigan. And then you take the two layers of your border and you just, I have to find the little hole here. So you can close your cardigan or your coat on every height. So that's a nice way of close your coat, but it's not really necessary. It hangs like an A-line. It's a very nice fitting coat. I have put a lot of effort in this video workshop. It's one of my best videos ever. If you have questions, join my Made with Miranda Facebook group or ask your question under the video in the messages. And for the rest, yes, check the description to get all the info. And for the rest, let's start. Just let's start. Have a lot of fun. It's a nice weekend project. And yes, I will explain it as good as possible. But it is simple project to be true. It's a very simple project. I have done the math. And you only have to knit and assemble. And even the assembling is very much fun to do. So, hey yo, let's go! This video workshop is for a circular knitting machine with 46 or 48 needles. When you don't have a machine in this size and you have a machine with 22 needles, see the description of this video for a link to a video to knit a fairy coat with your small circular knitting machine. It's also the same kind of pattern, but it works a little bit different. So see the link in the description to go to that video. When you have a circular knitting machine like the Addy King side or a centro-like machine and you knit the pattern for my size, it's a kind of one size fits all. I have been using this amount of yarn. It's ideal to use scrap yarns and make your own multicolored fairy coat, but you can also use whatever yarn you have. For my project, I have been using Happy Colors, trendy yarn for crochet and knitting. It is produced for Lemmy Yarns in Holland. I live in Holland. And there's also a website, so maybe it's also available in your country. It's called lammyyarns.com. The yarn I have been using is for size needle 4 to 4.5 millimeters, and it contains 75% acrylic and 25% wool. They are huge and very long, and I had to use 4.5 of these to get about this length together. But you can use whatever yarn you and your machine likes, of course. This is not an exact number because yarn and tension can give another result. But I've been using this amount of yarn in my fairy coat. I'm also using a pair of scissors. I'm using yarn needles. I lose them a lot, so I'm using a lot. And I'm using a crochet hook. Not for crochet, but it's a tool with a hook, and that's handy. There are also hooks on the machine, so it's not typical for crochet. But I'm using a size 5.5 millimeter or 6 millimeter. In Europe we use millimeters, but maybe you live somewhere else. And then you can find on Google the comparing size for your country you're living in. So you will find this comparing size on Google. This is what you need, and you also need a lot of yarn scraps. Everything is going to be explained step by step in the video. So let's enjoy this project and have a lot of fun. The first part of the project is the base, and the base is the part from the hoodie, the shoulders and the sleeves, and for that you have to knit 3 tubes. I'm going to demonstrate to you how you have to knit them and how you have to mark them. We use markings that makes assembling a lot easier, and for the markings we only use some pieces of scrap yarn. Take a moment and make a print screen of this chart, and then I'm going to explain to you what it means. Tube A is a tube of 200 rows, but we are going to mark after 30 rows. Then we restart counting and mark after 140 rows. And then restart counting and knit 30 rows. Tube B is a very long tube because it's also the hoodie. So the hoodie is 150 rows plus the rows that are written down here. You knit 30 rows and mark. Then you knit 70 rows and mark. Then you knit 150 rows and mark. Knit another 70 rows and mark. And then end with 30 rows. So 30 plus 70 plus 150 plus 70 plus 30 is 350 row long tube. Don't forget to cast on and cast off like I show you after this. And then you knit tube C. Tube C is 50 rows, then 140 rows and 50 rows with markings in between. So tube C is 240 rows long. Tube A is basically from elbow to elbow. When you want to knit this for a very long person, the pattern is easily adjustable. I will show everything. The pattern I'm showing you is a kind of one size fits all, but you can easily check if your yarn and tension will match about the same length. Knit a swap, just longer than 10 rows, and then count 10 rows somewhere in the middle on the side you will find those V-stitches, and mark the first one and then count 10 V-stitches. The marked one is the first one, and then you count your 10 stitches. Then you mark the last one, and then you can measure. I'm using centimeters, but it doesn't matter what kind of measurement you use. You find the measurement for 10 rows, and when you multiply it 20 times, you get the measurement for 200 rows. And that length should be from elbow to elbow, but since the machine knits with the same needles, it will probably always be the same length, so measurement is not necessary. When you want to make it really smaller or bigger, you can simply adjust the pattern by increasing or decreasing rows. When you want to have a bigger size, you add 10 rows on the back and 10 rows on the front of your project. I did the math, so don't get confused. The 140 rows are the back of your project, and we have to add or leave 10 rows on the 140 part. So you just change the number into 130 to make it smaller and 150 to make it bigger. So you knit 10 rows or you knit 10 rows less. Write this new number on your pattern when you want to adjust. Then we go to tube B. You have to knit 10 rows less or more between the 30 row marks. So say in the middle of the 150 part, you knit 10 rows less or more. And in the C tube, you have to knit 10 rows in the 140 part, and on the 50 row parts you have to increase or decrease 5 rows on both sides, because those are the front panels. It may look complex, but it's not when you follow the workshop step by step. So for this method, increase or decrease 10 rows on the back of tube A, 10 rows on the back of tube B, and of course in the middle of all tube C's, 10 rows and 5 rows on the left and right front panels. So that's how you can increase and decrease. This is the base of our coat, and when we have joined them into a small coat, we can start adding length. And we add length on tube C, whether it's the skirt part or whether it's more length for the body part. You fit it when you make it, so I have fitted mine and I knitted another tube C because I want to add more length to my body before I start assembling the skirt to my coat. So the lowest part of tube C will be the part where you start adding the skirt. The most simple way to add a size is adding another border at the end of the project, and then you don't have to calculate anything. So when the basic tube A is okay from elbow to elbow, but on the front you need some more fabric, just add an extra border at the end and you will have another extra size on the front. So that's not a problem, it's very simple. Adding an extra border gives a lot of size extra on the front panels. So sizing up or down by knitting more or less rows. Make another screenshot of this chart and remember that you can easily check if the row count will fit from about elbow to elbow. But you can also make sleeves longer on a simple way. But this is basically the start pattern, and adding sleeves you can make them as long as you like to make it fit at the end. So it's a fantastic pattern. You make it your size on the go. It's very simple, so let's continue the complete workshop. And when there are subjects you already know, just use the timestamps. These are my knitted tubes for the base. Tube A, 200 rows with marks between 30, 140 and 30. Tube B, 350 rows with marks between 30, 50, 20, 150, 20, 50 and 30. And tube C, 2 times 240 rows with marks between 50, 140 and 50. In the next steps, I will show you how to mark the tubes when knitting them, how to start and to finish them off. You also have to label the tubes so you know what tube is what letter, A, B or C. We have to mark our tubes for assembling, so I'm going to demonstrate to you how you can mark your tubes when you're knitting them at certain points. It's very simple. You only need some pieces of scrap yarn. So I'm knitting my tube and I have to mark it on row 150. So I'm at row 148 now, but my counter stops. But when I continue, it will pick up again. And I'm going to mark my first stitch of the row number 150. And for that, I take a little piece of scrap yarn. I put it under the hook of the first needle of row 150. And then I continue knitting and the needle grabs both yarns. And I knit until I'm almost done with my row 150 and I reset my counter and I'm starting to knit my first row. And now I have to watch carefully that both loops are around those two teeth. And then I'm knitting my first row and continue knitting my tube until I have reached the end or until I need to add another marker. This is an easy way to mark your rows for assembling, and when done you can easily remove them after finishing your project. You have to knit these tubes with the use of scrap yarn. I'm going to demonstrate to you how you can add the scrap yarn and how you can remove it very quick. First, I'm going to start to knit with my scrap yarn a couple of rows. And then I'm going to change to another color of scrap yarn. I'm just cutting my yarn, putting it to the inside between the last and the first needle. And then I take another piece of scrap yarn and put it into my feeder, also between the last and the first needle. Make sure that the tails are long enough to reach the table. And knit one round, so every single needle has to pick the color once. I'm cutting my yarn and putting my tail between the last and the first needle, as every tail I have used. And then I'm taking my working yarn. I'm hanging a long piece of thread inside my machine because I'm going to use it to pick up my stitches and do whatever I want to do with them. I'm going to demonstrate to you how I like to close my tube. But first, you have to put your yarn between the last and the first needle. And then you are going to knit. So what have we done? We have started with scrap yarn, changed to another color and knit one round with scrap yarn. And now I'm just knitting my desired pattern. That's not interesting because that's for a special project. And now I'm finished. I'm cutting my yarn a long piece because I want to use it to close my tube. I'm taking it out of the feeder between the last and the first needle. again. And then I'm going to put my scrap yarn into my feeder between the last and the first needle. And I'm going to knit 1 round. See? Just the same place all the time between the last and the first needle. 1 round, so every needle just picks the yellow color in this case 1 time. I'm taking it out of the feeder and I'm taking another piece of scrap yarn. And I'm going to knit a couple of rounds with the scrap yarn. And after knitting a couple of rounds, there are no rules. I'm just cutting my yarn and knitting until my work drops from the machine. So I'm continue cranking when my yarn runs out until my project comes loose. Now I'm going to demonstrate how I'm going to close the tube. I'm going to close the tubes with the use of my 5.5mm crochet hook. It's 5.5mm. You can search for your size in your country. Tubes have 2 ends, the casting on and the casting off end, and we are going to start with the casting off end. I'm turning the inside to the outside and I'm going to show you the last knitted stitches with my working yarn that are captured between the scrap yarn. And when you put all those ends to the right, you will find your working yarn and you will find those 2 yarn tails of that single strand row. So those 3 ends we need. You see that the working yarn is in the middle and the yarn end closest to you goes into the first stitch we need to close the first pair. So I stick my needle through that last stitch and to the first stitch. Look, the working yarn is in the middle and those 2 yarn tails are coming out of those 2 stitches, and when you look at the rest of the stitches you will see that you can line them up easily into pairs. I'm putting my needles into all the pairs so you can see how it looks like. And this way you can see if you're doing it correct, because a tube with 22 stitches has 11 pair stitches. So I have to check if I have 11 pair. If not, I made a mistake with picking up those first pair, those first 2 stitches. Now I'm putting my needle into my last pair. Those are next to each other, but also in front of each other. And now I have 11 pairs. And I'm ready to close the pairs. So I'm sticking my crochet hook into that first 2 loops and I'm taking my working yarn, and with the hook I'm going to pull the yarn through the 2 loops. And now I've started closing my tube. I'm going to pick up the next pair, pulling the yarn through all 3 loops on my hook. From now on I have 3 loops on my hook every time I'm going to close a pair. And I'm going to close all 11 pairs. And my last stitch. You always end with a pair. And then I'm pulling my yarn another time through that single loop. And the tube is closed. You have the scrap yarn tails on the right. I'm turning so that my working yarn is on the right. And now I'm going to pull out that single row with scrap yarn. That easy, and you can lift off the rest. And now this side of your tube, the end is closed. And now we have to close the beginning of the tube. And that first stitch is a little bit more difficult to find. The hidden stitch is easy to find, but most people make the mistake by not searching for it. So they look at the loops and they think that this stitch is the first stitch and this is the opposite stitch. But it's not. You have to look at where your scrap yarn goes through. Find the first two loops where the yarn ends of the scrap yarn go through. And then you will find that the piece closest to you, that stitch, is a little bit hidden. This is the first stitch and the opposite stitch, and the working yarn is in between. And when you're not sure, you are going to count your 11 pairs. Again, line them up. And my last pair, you always end with a pair. And then you continue closing as we did at the end of the tube, exactly the same way. When you are getting used to this, you don't need all those needles anymore. They are just for learning purpose. And sometimes I make also a mistake and I don't end up with a pair. And when I don't end up with a pair, I made a mistake. So I have to undo the closing by just pulling out those stitches and start over again with finding the real first pair. And then you close it the same way. We start assembling with our tubes A and B to each other. There are different numbers and you have marked your tubes, so we are going to use those marks. You can find them on the edges of your tubes. Tube A is short and tube B is long, but we are going to start at the same side and we join them to the middle of tube A. But I'm going to fold this paper so you can see what we really are going to do, because we are going to join it partly on both sides, and then the rest of tube B is going to be the hoodie. This paper example is not the best example, but I'm going to demonstrate it to you with the real tubes. And we start with just lining them up together on the right, and we are going to join to the middle of the short tube 30 and 70 rows, and then we start at the opposite end with a new piece of yarn and we join that end also. And then it's so easy that explaining is difficult. So let's start. So basically I'm going to join both tubes for 100 rows from the right to the left or from the left to the right. How are we going to join them? At the edge of your tube you will find a straight line of V stitches. Look, when you hold it up like this, there are all those V-stitches in just one straight line. We are going to use those stitches, but we are going to put our needle in the stitch, and when you put it under those V's in the middle, you will find those bars under the V-stitches. I call them the vertical bars. And those bars we are going to use on both tubes. Look, like this. You just follow that straight line of V-stitches when joining, and you put your needle through the holes between the vertical bars. It's very simple. Stick your needle with the yarn into the first V-stitch of one of the tubes under the first vertical bar and pull through your yarn. Then go to the opposite side, the opposite tube, and find your first vertical bar, pull through the yarn. Don't pull through all the way. Leave a long tail and go into the first tube, there where you came out, the same hole, the same spot, and pick up 2 vertical bars and do the same. Go in where you came out in the opposite tube, go under 2 bars and come out. Don't pull at your yarn, and this is what you are going to continue until you find the mark that marks the middle of tube A. It's going to be your 100 point mark or mark number 3, because I've marked row 30 in this pattern and row 50 and 20. Make sure your yarn is longer than the longest panel, and best leave it onto your ball. And I see you back when you are at mark number 100 or the 3rd mark. And then we continue doing it from the opposite side. You start at both ends and you join them also to those 3rd mark, and that will be on the same spot where you finish your first joining. And then there is our hoodie, and we have to close that. So I will continue closing the tube. I pull at my yarn and it will close as if it is knitted in just one straight line. You finish off the ends after completing the cardigan. So continue following the marks to the middle, do it from the other side, leave all the tails, and then we continue closing the hoodie. I'm almost finished with assembling both tubes, and I'm doing my last pairs of stitches so that both sides will join and form the back of our hoodie. It doesn't matter if you go 1 stitch further or less, as long as you are make sure that you continue closing until you have closed it totally. Pull the yarn, make sure it's in the right tension, and then continue closing the hoodie. I'm going to put my yarn under the last 2 bars of the previous one. So I'm doing those cross points double. So I'm going through the same stitch, making sure not going through the yarn. And then I'm going to continue closing the hoodie with the same piece of yarn that I have in my hand. So making sure everything is in right tension, the right size. In the next step, we are going to close the underarms. We are going to close them the first 30 rows. We are not going to close them all the way like we did on the opposite side. We are going to close just to the first mark, those first 30 rows. The rest we leave open. So we're not going to close it all the way, only the first mark. I'm starting at the edge. I'm finding my rows. I can find the marks. So finding my first V-stitch on both tubes and continue closing them pair by pair, 2 by 2, until you reach the second mark or row 80. It's just the same as you did before. When you finish, you just pull at the yarn, or when your yarn is a little bit short, you just pull and you can pull it through. And when you reach your mark, you are ready, and continue it on the opposite side. Here's my mark. Make sure you don't put your yarn through the yarn. So I pull at my work and then do the same on the other side. Start at the end and connect the first 30 rows. Leave the tails, and when your work is closed, it should look like this. In the next step, we are going to assemble part C. It's going to look like this, and we are going to assemble them like this. Lay your work like this, the hoodie far away, fronting towards you. On the bottom, tube A. It's connected like this. You've done that already, and 140 stitches are unworked for now. And that's correct. The middle 140 rows of tube C and A are corresponding, and the front 50 rows of panel C are corresponding to panel A. And we are going to join it all the way around, like this. So we are making sure that we start at the right position to make sure that the middle 140 rows correspond to each other, and the first 50 rows are corresponding here. It's going to fit. When you cannot find your mark, the mark should be visible also at the opposite. So sometimes the mark is on the opposite side. You can just find the mark and then follow the row on the panel where you need to know where the mark is, and you follow it to the side. You put a stitch marker or something, and then you know where to start. And then you start joining panel C to panel B, where the stitch mark or the mark is. It's row 50 from the last mark, and you are going to close it. I'm going to turn my work because I'm right-handed. I don't cut my yarn tail because then I'm always sure that I have enough. And I'm going to start joining those two tubes by picking up one stitch at the edge from every tube and then pick them up, the rest of the 50 stitches, pair by pair until you reach the mark at 50 rows. And it's also a kind of cross point. We have done this before, so I will speed up the video. And when I'm done, I'm pulling at my yarn, making sure the tension is correct of my sleeve. And then you continue joining panel C to panel A on the 140 rows on the back with the same piece of yarn. And you go until you reach the opposite side. So. I'm going to do it all the way till I reach this point. And then finish the front. So I continue. I'm lining A and C up to each other. I pick up the first two bars that are already connected to the other tube. So I'm going through those two holes again. And then continue joining all those rows in pairs, following the same two tracks until you reach the end of the back part. And then I see you back. Go as far as possible with joining C to A to the back. Also make sure that the tension is correct. Continue joining. Don't go through your yarn with the needle, but only through the holes. And then you really are at the end of your bag. Then flip the end of tube C to the front and continue joining panel C to panel B on the front. Just like this, it fits. I turn my work because I'm right-handed again. And then, when you have joined this, you have a short cardigan with short sleeves. And that's the base of the rest of your cardigan. It's getting very dark in here, so I will see you back when I am finished with joining these two tubes to each other. This is how my cardigan looks when A, B and C are joined, and I'm going to add another tube C to add length. And this is what the finished base looks like. And now the next step is to make the skirt, and I will demonstrate it step by step from start to finish. In this part of the video I will show you how I calculated the flat panels that will be the skirt attached to the cardigan or to the coat. We are going to attach them with the V-stitches to the vertical bars of the coat. I will explain that to you so you can make it seamless. So we are going to join those bars to the V-stitches and it's going to be seamless. For that I have to calculate how wide our panels need to be. I already calculated it for you, but I will demonstrate how I did it so you can use it in the future. The formula is 240 rows with the vertical bars, divided into 3 and then multiple into 2, and that makes that we need 160 V-stitches on our skirt to assemble. I've calculated that I need 8 panels. It's 160 divided into 8, makes panels wide 20 stitches, plus 1, because we will lose it when we are going to join the panels to each other. So we need to cast on 21 stitches 8 times for 8 panels. I'm going to demonstrate everything, of course. And after casting on the 21 stitches, we need to increase our work to get wider panels. For my coat, I increased every 6th and every 1st row 1 stitch. When you want to have a shorter panel, for sleeves for example, you are going to increase on row 4, and row 1. For a longer panel, you increase on row 10 and row 1, or row 8 and row 1, and so you can play. Your panel will be wide 43 stitches, and when you want to have a really wide skirt, you can cast on less stitches and increase more, so you get real wide panels at the end and small panels at the beginning. So make a swatch and try something if you don't like my length. Remember that it's very important to make all panels the same length, and that you don't forget to add the extra stitch when casting on, because you will lose 1 stitch when assembling the sides to each other. After assembling, you won't see the edges anymore. So I'm going to demonstrate to you how to knit these kind of panels. Knitting flat and increasing is not difficult. We are going to cast on with scrap yarn. Make sure the tail touches the table. Start just at whatever needle and cast on 21 stitches. Leave your machine in circular mode. We never use the panel mode. Cast on 21 stitches. Make sure that the yarn is under the bump after the last needle and under all the bumps, that's important. And then put it into your yarn feeder. So the yarn ends between the 21st and the 22nd needle, under the bump in between. And then start knitting with the scrap yarn your first row. Make sure that when the yarn slides off the bump, you give a little tug to your yarn so the loop closes neat. Continue knitting the whole row until you come to the first needle. Make sure everything is in place and knit until the yarn slides under the bump after the first needle. So this is the moment where you turn. So this is an empty needle and the yarn has to slide under the bump. And then you give a little tug on your yarn so the yarn makes a nice loop. Continue this for a few rows. Turn when the yarn slides under the bump. Give a little tug. Knit. Make sure that the yarn is in place. Knit until it slides under. Turn. And this is how you start with your scrap yarn knitting flat. And when you have done a few rows, we are going to change to our second color of scrap yarn. So I'm going to crank another row. And then I'm going to change to my second color scrap yarn. I'm finished with this color scrap yarn. I'm putting my yarn to the inside, making sure that it touches the table and that the yarn is under the hook. I crank further, circular, until the first needle rises. And then I take my second color of scrap yarn, making sure everything is in place. All the stitches need to be around those little teeth. I put it to the inside long enough that it touches the table, and I'm going to knit one row with this scrap yarn. Making sure that the last needle grabs that yarn, taking it out of the feeder, putting it to the inside, and crank further to the first needle. And when it rises, we are going to put our working yarn on the machine. I'm taking a long tail because I need it to close the panel later. Make sure you put your yarn between the empty and the first needle. That's very important. And start cranking your first real row of your panel. Knit all 21 stitches. Make sure that the yarn slides under the bump after the 21st needle, and then continue cranking row 2, making sure you do exactly the same as we did before. Crank until the yarn slides under the bump and change direction and start knitting row 3. Continue to the end until the yarn slides under the bump. Other direction, knit row 4. Row 5. And row 6. And at the end of row 6, this is the point where we should return, but we are going to increase. So instead of when the yarn slides under this bump, we are going to crank one needle further, and when it slides under this bump, we are going to return. So not this one, but this one. So I'm going to knit one stitch further, slide, return. And this is the increase on my 6th row, at the end of my 6th row. I'm going to do that every other first and sixth row. Because I'm demonstrating, of course, I have to help. So that's an extra stitch now. And now this is my first row, and I'm going to increase 1 stitch at every first row. Go back, and that was my first row. Second row is not increasing. Make sure that everything is in place. Your row is 2 stitches wider now. Row 3. Row 4. Now my machine gets stuck. It's an old one, so just be gentle. Yes, row 4. My 5th row. And there comes my 6th row. And I have to increase. So I'm going to knit 1 bump further. And then return knitting my first row. And increasing 1 stitch. 1 stitch more. Return row 2. 3. 4, 5, 6, increase 1, increase 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, increase 1, increase 2, etc. And you keep continuing adding stitches every 6th and 1st row until you end with 3 empty needles after a increase at the 1st row. So continue knitting and increasing every 6th and 1st row, ending with a 1st row, and then you have left 3 empty needles. Then you have an addy. When you have a centro, you have left also 3 empty needles, but you have knitted more rows and added 2 more stitches. But that's not a problem. So you can use the same pattern. The most important part is the casting on side. So the 21 stitches and the length. You have to make them all the same amount of rows. Now I'm doing my last increase on the first round and I have 3 empty needles left. You cannot increase any more. There has to be always 3 needles left. I continue cranking until the 6th row and then I stop. I do not add any more stitches. I'm done knitting. I'm done knitting with my 6th row and now I stop knitting and I put my yarn to the inside. You can cut your yarn with a long tail or just leave it like this. We need a long tail for finishing off this side of the panel. But first we have to continue knitting with scrap yarn. Make sure the tail is long enough and put it to the machine between the empty and the first knitted stitch needles. Knit 1 row with the scrap yarn. Make sure that you knit all needles with knitting on it. And when you're at the end, cut your yarn long enough that it touches the table and put it to the inside between the last knitted needle and the first empty needle. Close the door. Continue cranking circular until the first needle rises where the knitting is on, and then you take another color of scrap yarn and put it to the inside with the tail long enough that it touches the table between the empty needle and the first used needle, and start cranking circular a couple of rounds. You can do that without any problems. Make sure that all the loops are in place and continue cranking. The empty needles won't knit proper, but that's not important. Knit about 5 or maybe a few more rows when you're not used to this technique, and when you have done that you just cut your yarn and continue cranking even when the yarn is finished, and keep on cranking until your work got released from the machine. Check that all the loops are correct placed around the needles so your work will get released without any problems. Sometimes you have to help a loop, but this time it works fine. It's come loose from the machine and it looks very nice and ready for finishing off. We continue finishing off our panel at the side where we finished. We are using a crochet hook. I'm using 5.5 millimeters. Look at your work. It has to look like this. You look at the ribbed side and you have the ends, the yarn ends of the scrap yarn and the working yarn on your right, and then you are going to find your first loop with your working color yarn. The scrap yarn is coming out of that loop, and then poke your needle through the loop, and with the hook you pull through the working yarn through the loop on your hook. The next loop is just next to that first loop. Poke in your hook, pull the yarn through that loop and the loop on your hook. And continue doing this all the way. You see all those loops are next to each other. You stick your needle in the loop, pull through the yarn through both loops on your hook. Do it a little bit loose and do it all the way. It's the best way to count your stitches. You know how many stitches you have knitted. So count your stitches from the beginning to the end and secure all stitches this way. So your work won't unravel when you remove the scrap yarn in just a second. I'm almost done. Don't forget the last loop. Your scrap yarn will come out of that loop. And then pull through the yarn another time and cut the yarn. And then we are going to do the magic trick. We are removing the scrap yarn, the 1 strand scrap yarn. We are going to remove it from our work by just pulling it out. Poking my hook under that string and I just going to pull it out slowly. And the rest of the scrap yarn is separated from my panel. And my panel is finished off on this side. It's very nice. And then we continue it on the opposite side, the casting on side. It's almost the same. Keep it like this with the scrap yarn on top and the rib side towards you. And then you have to find your first stitch from your working yarn. That's not very difficult to find. It's the first real loop from your working yarn, with your working yarn. Poke your needle through and you will see all those loops between the scrap yarn all in just one line. We have casted on 21 stitches, so I have to close 21 stitches. The last stitch, most people forget it, but I'm going to demonstrate to you where it is. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And then we have the last loop that's on the side and the scrap yarn runs through. So when you pull the scrap yarn, you will find it going through a loop, and that's the last stitch you don't have to forget. It's stitch 21. So you're picking up that stitch and then you pull through the working yarn and another loop for finishing off. And then all stitches are secured and you can start removing your scrap yarn by just pulling out that one single strand of scrap yarn and taking off the rest. And then your first panel is finished. When you look at the panel, you will see that it will roll to the inside at the edges and to the outside at the top and bottom. That's not a problem. That will correct when you attach them to each other. And the sides will be hidden on the inside, so it's going to work out fine. So knit all 8 panels exactly the same, and then we continue the next step. Joining these panels is not difficult. You will get a nice flat seam on the outside and a neat seam on the inside. And the most beautiful part of the joining is that your work will stop rolling where it's joined. First I'm going to explain it on paper and then I will demonstrate it to you. We are going to join them by the vertical bars that you will find under the V-stitches next to the edge. When you look at the edge, that's basically nothing. Next to the edge you will find a line with V-stitches, and when you poke your needle under the V's, you will see the vertical bars, and we are going to use them, not the side stitches, but the vertical bars, to join the panels to each other. So you start at the smallest side. Don't use the edge, but use the straight line with real V-stitches and find the vertical bars. The stitches are just in a straight line. Make sure you use those stitches, not those side stitches. And we are going to join the panels with those bars, 1 by 1, 2 by 2 by 2, until you reach the increase, and then we are going to hop over. You're going to hop over to the next created line with V-stitches. So you're knitting flat, hop over, knitting flat, hop over at every increase. I'm going to use a yarn tail that's long enough, or another piece of yarn. I'm putting it into my yarn needle. And then I'm going to join the panels. I'm joining them with the stockinette side facing towards me. I'm using the tail of this one, so I'm starting at the other one. I'm rolling the edge to the outside, and then I find the line with V-stitches next to the edge, and I'm poking my yarn needle under the first V-bar. We are going to join them 1 by 1 to start, and then 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 until we reach our increase. You have to get a little bit handy. I'm holding my index finger in between them. You don't pull at the yarn. I'm finding the first bar at the opposite side. And then I just go in where I went out at the other one. Join 2 bars and go to the opposite. Poke in where you came out. Join 2 bars. Poke in where you came out. Join 2 bars. Don't pull at your yarn. You are going to pull them together when you're finished or later on. So, and you have to keep in mind that every other pair of stitches you will find an increase. So you have to look at the edge. Sometimes when you increase, it gets wider. Look, here is an increase, and then you see that these are the V-stitches we are following. There is another line with V-stitches, and that's what we are going to do. We are poking in where we came out, and instead of coming out in the same line, you are going to hop over to the V-stitch that is new by the increasement. So this was the old one, and this is the new one. And then you continue. On the other side you will find an increasement also, probably, or maybe later. Instead of the same bars, you hop over to the increasement and continue from there. See? You just go to the next one, to the side. And then we have a couple of stitches just in that same line until the next increase comes by. So it's basically the same as joining tubes. And this is what it is. Just follow the lines, follow the train track. And when you come at an increase, you just hop over to the next track. And when ready, you just pull at the yarn. And when you have done it correctly, you can pull it and it's closed. And so you are going to join all your panels till you have one big piece of fabric. And don't cut the yarn tails. We are going to need them for finishing off. Now you have two different parts of your coat. You have the upper part and you have the skirt part. We are going to join the skirt part to the bottom of our body part in just one row all the way around. So we are joining it at the side of the lowest tube. You need your complete skirt finished and assembled, and then we are going to join them with the V-stitches under the edge, the V-stitches, and you will find them just lined up next to each other in rows, and you try to find the V-stitch just under the edge. Sometimes you use a V-stitch a bit lower because sometimes the panels are not even assembled, and we are going to join those V-stitches to the vertical bars, but we are not going to join them one by one. We are going to do them in series of two, one V-stitch to one bar and the second V-stitch to two bars. So first to one, second to two bars, and you repeat it all the way around. I'm going to show you how to do that. You need a real long piece of yarn because it has to fit all the way around. And then you are going to find the first V-stitch. It's not exactly on the edge, that's a half V-stitch. You need the real first V-stitch, and that's here. I'm going to pick that up. Sometimes you need to pick up one lower, but at the beginning you pick up the highest stitch. The lower stitch is when you have to cheat a little bit, when you are going to the next panel. But first I'm going to show you how we are going to join V's to vertical bars. I have joined my first V-stitch already, and I'm picking up the first vertical bar from the corner. We have done this before. It works basically the same, only now we have V-stitches on one side. Be careful with all the yarn ends, don't let them tangle. You go in at the V-stitch part where you came out and pick up the next V-stitch. Don't pull your yarn all the way through because then you cannot work proper. And go in at the bars where you are used to go in, where you came out, and pick up two bars because this is the second V-stitch. And that was my series. So I will start with one again in the beginning, all those yarn ends. So I'm going to pick up the first V-stitch with one vertical bar. Yes. And then I'm going to pick up the second V-stitch with two vertical bars. So 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 1, 2, 2. In the beginning it looks a bit messy. Untangle all the yarn and then you can go all the way. I will demonstrate to you how you will handle when the panels are joined, the point where the panels are joined. But first I have to continue the first panel, joining to the tube. I'm doing my last V now, and now I'm going to join the two panels by picking up the half V stitch on the edge of the first one and the other half V stitch on the edge of the second one. That's just before the real first V stitch, and together they will form a V stitch, and you handle it just as the rest by joining it with the bar. And then you continue joining the rest of the V stitches of the second panel the same way, doing the 1 1 2 2. When you pull at your yarn, and you have done it correctly, the panel will close seamless to the tube. I have to untangle the ends at the beginning. Take your time, never pull hard. We are working those tails off when we are finished with assembling the whole project. So continue doing it all the way around, and then I meet you back when it's done. And this is what it looks like now. And in the next step we are going to calculate and add the border. So let's continue. The border of our cardigan is a very long tube that goes all the way up from the bottom, along the hoodie and all the way down. I'm explaining it for Eddie king size and for Centro, but there is a slight difference that you don't notice when you use the same pattern. You want to have the border fitting all the way around and nice. So there is a formula for it. It's not difficult. The upper part are the same numbers, and the C tubes are different, as you can see. And what also can be different are the numbers for the skirt. For the skirt, we have to add the border the same amount of rows for your skirt. You can easily calculate how many rows you did if you did not use my pattern, just by counting the V's. In my pattern, I have knitted 72 rows. That means that the height of this is the same as the height of the border here, so therefore I have to knit 72 rows with the Addi king size upwards. Then I have the two tubes with 240 rows, we call them tube C. To cover that distance, we have to knit 34 rows on our border. I have added 2 tubes C, so I have to knit 34 and 34 rows. Then for the base of the pattern that we knitted from A and B, we have to knit 20, 150 and 20 rows. That's the same with every machine, even with the small machine, the 22 needle machine. That's exactly the same amount of numbers. So the base is 20, 150 and 20. For the 48 machine also exactly the same. And then going downwards, we have to knit the same numbers as at this side. So 20 and 36, 36 for the machine with 48 rows. So basically, then you have to count them, and the numbers are 470 rows when you follow my pattern. And when you have added another tube C, you add 34 rows and 34 rows of the opposite side. And when you have added longer or shorter panels here, you add that amount of rows instead of the 72. You just change the numbers. You can add 34 and 34, and you can change those numbers. And those are the numbers that can change And with the centro you knit 36 rows to cover the tubes C. So when you have followed my pattern with centro or addi, you have to knit this amount of rows for the tubes using the 1 second remove scrap yarn method and closing them up. And then I will demonstrate, of course, how to assemble the border to your magic fairy coat. Adding the border is simple. You start at the bottom, all the way along the skirt, all the way up, all the way along the hoodie, and all the way down again, ending at the other end of the skirt. So you have knitted your very, very long border. You use your yarn needle and your yarn. I don't cut my yarn, I keep it, so I always have enough because it's a very long end. On the border I'm going to use the vertical bars, the railroad, just that one very long line. And on the skirt I'm going to use also the vertical bars, but just the single layer. But we are going to join the bars versus bars as we did before. The only difference is that we are going to use the hop on the skirt side because it's going to get smaller. And on the border you can use the bars in the same row. So that's that part. Then you continue with joining the V-stitches to the vertical bars with the tube C's. 1 V-stitch, 1 bar, second V-stitch, 2 bars. You do that along the edge and in the same track. After the tube C, you go to the strange corner. You just fold it and then you go smoothless over into joining bars to bars all the way around the hoodie. So it's just bars to bars all the way around the hoodie until you come to the strange corner, and then you change to joining bars to V-stitches. Just like on the opposite side, along the C tubes, and then the last end you join the vertical bars to the vertical bars with a hop. It's getting wider now, so the hop goes to the edge. Also check if the length is the same, and otherwise you smuggle a bit. So join the border all the way around. And this is how your fairy coat should look like now. Next part is the rest of the sleeves. When you have used a addiexpress, your sleeve will be wide, 46 stitches in the round, 46 V-stitches in the round. When you have used a centro-like machine, your sleeve will be 48 stitches in the round. With the addi, I'm going to scrap yarn cast on 23 stitches plus 1 and increase on my panel every 6th and 1st row until my panel is wide enough and made 2 panels. With the centro, I cast on 24 plus 1 stitch, and for the rest I increase every 6th and 1st row and knit also 2 panels the same way. You can add length just by the explaining I did before. Knit your panels and assemble them into 2 sleeves like this. And then we are going to join the sleeves to the sleeves. It's basically very simple. We are going to join V-stitches to V-stitches, and for that you can simply join 1 V-stitch to 1 V-stitch. I like to join them upside down in the opposite side, but you can also join them both the V side. So I'm just going to join them. It should fit. It's just joining them stitch by stitch. You can start wherever you like. I start at the cross point, but you can also start somewhere else. I'm looking for my first real V-stitch. It's on the edge. And then I take the rest of my sleeve and I will find my opposite V-stitch, my first one. And that's here. And then I'm going to join a V to V all the way around. You go in where you came out. It's all basically the same. And when you have done one sleeve, you do the other one exactly the same. And then your fairy coat is finished and you only have to tuck away stitches by knotting them and putting them between layers or putting them away into the ridges that are on the flat panels. And then it's finished before you know it. It's going to be so nice. And then it's finished. I hope you liked this free workshop. If you want to donate something to keep this channel free available, please give a small donation to my PayPal. See the description of this video. And please give me a thumb up and join my channel if you want to see more of my circular knitting machine workshops. Check the description of this video for a lot of helpful information. Thank you for watching. Stay safe. With love from Holland. Bye bye.